He was 12 kilometers from the trailhead, 12 kilometers of dense boreal forest, loose shale switchbacks, and a trail that had already faded to almost nothing in the last hour of light. His pack weighed 31 pounds. His water supply was down to half a liter. And somewhere behind him, moving through the tree line with the kind of patience that only apex predators truly possess, a pack of wolves had been tracking him for the better part of 40 minutes. This is not a story about what went wrong in a single dramatic moment. This is a story about how a series of small, almost imperceptible decisions, each one reasonable on its own, can compound into something that pushes a human being to the absolute edge of what they are capable of surviving. And it is a story about what happens when the wilderness reminds you, quietly at first, and then with unmistakable clarity, that you are not at the top of every food chain in every place on this earth. If you have ever felt that specific electric tension of being watched from the tree line, if you have ever had the hair rise on the back of your neck for no reason you could immediately explain, then stay with this. Because what Marcus Ellery experienced on the eastern slope of the Kananaskis backcountry on a Thursday evening in late October is one of the most thoroughly documented, deeply analyzed, and genuinely extraordinary survival accounts to come out of North American wilderness in recent years. And we are going to walk through every single kilometer of it. Before we get into that, if stories like this one keep you up at night in the best possible way, if you live for the raw, unfiltered reality of what human beings are capable of when everything is stripped away, then make sure you subscribe right now. Hit that button. Because we have more of these, and they are not the kind of thing you want to miss in your feed. Now, let us go back to the beginning, because Marcus did not simply wander into the wilderness unprepared. In fact, by almost any reasonable standard, Marcus Ellery was a prepared and experienced backcountry traveler. And that matters enormously for understanding what happened. Marcus was 34 years old at the time. He had been hiking in the Canadian Rockies for 11 years. He was not a weekend warrior in brand new boots with a day pack full of granola bars. He had completed the Great Divide Trail. He had solo-packed the Bowron Lake Circuit in British Columbia. He had spent 12 nights alone in Jasper, in conditions that would send most people back to the trailhead before nightfall on the first day. Marcus was, by any reasonable measure, the kind of person who knew what he was doing. He had planned this particular route for 3 weeks. It was a 5-day loop in the Kananaskis region of Alberta, taking him through a high alpine corridor, dropping into a valley watershed, traversing a ridge system that sees very few human visitors outside of the summer months, and returning to his vehicle via a lower forest trail. He had studied the topography. He had filed a trip plan with the relevant provincial authorities. He had checked the wildlife advisory reports for the area, which at the time of his departure flagged wolf activity as moderate, a designation that, as Marcus would later describe it, meant something entirely different once you are actually standing in the middle of it. He set out on a Monday morning. The first 3 days were, by his own account, extraordinary. The kind of hiking that reminds you why you put yourself through the physical misery of carrying 30 pounds on your back through country that does not want you there. He saw elk on the second morning, a herd of about 20 animals moving through a frost-covered meadow below his camp, their breath hanging in columns of steam in the still air. He found a spring-fed creek on the third afternoon that was cold enough to make his teeth ache and clear enough to read the geology of the stream bed through a full meter of water. He was, he later said, completely and utterly content. The trouble began, as it so often does, not with a catastrophic event, but with a small miscalculation. On the evening of the third day, Marcus pushed further than he had planned. He had been making good time. The weather was holding. The ridge he was traversing offered views that he simply did not want to leave behind, and so he kept moving, just a little longer, just a little further, just 1 more kilometer. It was still light. He could see his intended camp spot from where he stood. It seemed entirely reasonable. By the time he made camp, he had covered 22 kilometers instead of the planned 17. He was tired in a way that felt good, the satisfying deep tiredness of a body that has worked hard and accomplished something real. He ate, he filtered water from a nearby trickle, he set up his shelter with practiced efficiency, and he went to sleep with the quiet satisfaction of a man who is exactly where he wants to be. He woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of howling. It was not close. Not immediately. The sound was coming from across the valley, long and resonant and extraordinary in the way that wolf howling always is when you hear it, in a place where no human voice has carried for weeks. Marcus lay in his sleeping bag and listened. He counted at least 3 distinct voices, possibly 4. The chorus rose and fell, and then faded into the particular quality of silence, that only exists in places genuinely far from human civilization. He lay there for a long time after it stopped, staring at the fabric ceiling of his shelter, and he felt something that he described later as being perfectly balanced between exhilaration and unease. He went back to sleep. He would think about that moment many times in the days that followed. The fourth day began with a heavy frost and a sky that had changed character overnight. The clean, hard blue of the previous days had been replaced by a milky overcast that sat low over the ridgelines and gave the light a flat, directionless quality. Marcus noted it, packed camp, and moved out. He had a long day ahead. The route he had planned would take him down off the ridge system, through a forested transition zone, and into the valley corridor that would eventually bring him back toward the trailhead. Given his extra distance from the previous day, he was now looking at roughly 24 kilometers to reach his planned final camp, from which the trailhead was only a short morning walk. It was ambitious, he knew that. But the weather seemed stable, his body felt good, despite the exertion of the previous days, and he had done longer days in heavier conditions than this. He moved well through the morning, covering the ridge descent faster than expected, finding a use trail through the transition forest that cut several kilometers off his route. By midday, he had covered nearly 14 kilometers, and he was, by his own account, feeling genuinely confident. This is the point in almost every wilderness survival account where the person telling the story describes the moment they first noticed something was different, the moment before they knew what they were dealing with. And Marcus describes his moment with a precision that suggests he has replayed it many, many times. He was moving through a section of mixed conifer forest, the kind of terrain where the trees are close enough together to limit sight lines to 30 or 40 meters in most directions, where the ground is a mat of fallen needles that absorbs sound and makes movement quieter than it should be. He had stopped to check his map. He was standing still, pack on his back, looking at his compass bearing, and he heard nothing. He smelled nothing. He saw nothing. But he felt, with an absolute and inexplicable certainty, that something was watching him. He stood there for perhaps 30 seconds, looking up from his map and scanning the tree line in a slow, deliberate arc. Nothing moved. There was no sound. The birds that had been audible all morning had gone quiet, though he had not registered that consciously until this moment. He looked back at his map, made his bearing, and kept moving, but he kept moving faster than he had been. 40 minutes later, at the edge of a small clearing, he saw the first wolf. It was standing at the far side of the clearing, perhaps 60 meters away, partly screened by a stand of young spruce. It was looking directly at him. It was large, a northern Rocky Mountain wolf, gray-bodied with a darker saddle across the back, and it was completely still. It did not run. It did not display any of the tail-raised, hackle-up posturing that wildlife guides describe as a sign of imminent aggression. It simply stood there, looking at him with an attention that felt, in Marcus's words, completely professional. Marcus stopped. He and the wolf looked at each other across the clearing for what he estimates was close to 2 minutes, though he acknowledges it may have been less. Then the wolf turned, unhurried, and walked back into the trees. Marcus stood there for a while after it disappeared. He had seen wolves in the wild before, twice, both times fleeting glimpses of animals moving away from him at speed. He had never had an experience like this. He checked his bear spray, which he carried clipped to his chest strap, noted that the safety was engaged, and made a decision that he would later describe as both logical and slightly foolish. He decided to keep going. The wolf had shown no aggression. He was on a trail, moving in a clear direction, making noise as he moved. Every piece of guidance he had ever read about wolf encounters said that wolves were not a serious threat to adult humans, that attacks were extraordinarily rare, that the animals were naturally shy and would avoid prolonged contact with people. What that guidance did not fully account for, and what Marcus was about to learn with a thoroughness that no written guidance could replicate, was the difference between a wolf encountering a human and a pack of wolves following one. He had been moving for another 20 minutes when he heard the first howl. It came from behind him, from the direction of the clearing. Short, declarative, not the long melodic call he had heard in the night. More like a single note of communication, and within seconds, it was answered. From his left, from his right, and from somewhere ahead of him that made his stomach drop in a way he could not have predicted. He stopped and counted. 4 distinct voices, possibly 5, spread around him in an arc that, if he was reading it correctly, covered at least 180 degrees of his position. He was not surrounded. Not quite, but the geometry of the sound was deeply uncomfortable, and Marcus was good enough at reading the wilderness to understand what he was hearing. He was 12 kilometers from the trailhead. He took a long, slow breath. He reached up and unclipped the safety on his bear spray. He looked at his map one more time, confirmed his bearing, and he made the decision that, more than anything else in this entire account, demonstrates the kind of clear-headed thinking that separates people who walk out of these situations from people who do not. He decided not to run. Everything in his body wanted to run. He described it later as the most physically insistent impulse he had ever experienced, stronger than hunger, stronger than exhaustion, almost as strong as the reflex to pull your hand back from a flame. Every primitive circuit in his nervous system was firing the same instruction: move, go, now, fast. And he stood there, breathing through it, and chose to walk. He chose to walk because he understood, with the part of his brain that was still operating analytically despite the adrenaline flooding his system, that running from a predator is the single worst thing a human being can do when a predator is watching. Running activates pursuit instinct. Running tells the animal behind you that you are prey, and Marcus was not prepared to be prey. Not yet. Not while he still had options. So he walked. He walked at a steady pace, deliberately, making himself move at the same rhythm he had been holding all day. He made noise. He talked to himself, loudly and calmly, narrating his movement through the forest in a steady, conversational tone. He called out at regular intervals, not the panicked shouting of a frightened person, but the firm, measured voice of someone who was announcing their presence with confidence. He made himself large where the terrain allowed. He held his bear spray in his right hand, held out slightly from his body, and he walked. For the first kilometer, he heard nothing. The forest was silent in the specific, loaded way it had been silent before he saw the wolf in the clearing. The birds were gone. There was no wind. His own footsteps on the needle mat sounded unnaturally loud. And then, at a point he later marked on his GPS as approximately 11 kilometers from the trailhead, he heard movement in the trees to his left. Not fast movement, not crashing, cracking, predatory charge movement. Just the quiet, deliberate sound of something large moving through undergrowth at exactly the same pace as he was walking. He did not look. This was a deliberate choice. He kept his head oriented forward and used his peripheral vision to scan the left side tree line. He saw nothing, but the sound continued, parallel to him, consistent, unhurried. 50 meters, 100 meters, 200 meters. Whatever was in the trees to his left had been walking beside him for 200 meters. Then he heard the same sound from the right. He was being flanked. Now, the thing about reading a survival account like this from the comfort and safety of wherever you are sitting is that it is very easy to analyze the moment, to apply the rational framework, to say what the person should or should not have done. But understanding Marcus's experience requires holding two things simultaneously in your mind. The first is that everything he did, from a technical standpoint, was correct. His decision-making under extraordinary stress was, by every objective measure, sound. And the second thing is that correct decision-making does not make you feel safe. It does not stop your hands from shaking. It does not slow your heart rate below 140 beats per minute. It does not make the sound of something large moving through the forest beside you in the darkening afternoon light feel like anything other than one of the most frightening things you have ever experienced. Marcus kept walking. He talked. He called out. He maintained his pace. He was 10 kilometers from the trailhead when he crested a small rise and saw, standing in the trail directly in front of him, 2 wolves. They were different animals from the one he had seen in the clearing. One was larger, a big male with a thick ruff and the broad head of a dominant animal. The other was slightly smaller, and it was standing at a slight angle, its body language less directly confrontational but clearly engaged. They were both looking at him. Neither was moving. The trail between Marcus and the 2 wolves was perhaps 40 meters of open ground. He stopped. He later described the cognitive process that happened in the next few seconds as the most compressed and intense thinking he had ever done. He had bear spray effective to approximately 8 meters. He had 2 wolves in front of him and at least 2 more flanking him in the trees on either side. He had 10 kilometers of forest between him and his vehicle. It was approximately 4 in the afternoon, and the light was already going flat and early under the overcast sky. He was physically tired, carrying a 31-pound pack, operating on the kind of adrenaline load that burns through energy reserves at a rate that has nothing to do with caloric intake. He assessed all of this in what felt like an instant, and he did the thing that every part of him resisted doing. He made himself bigger. He raised his arms above his head, spread them wide, made himself as visually large as possible, and in the loudest, most commanding voice he had, he told the wolves to leave. He did not scream. He did not beg. He spoke with authority, firmly, repeatedly, using the same tone of voice you might use with a very large dog that was considering doing something it should not. He held his bear spray extended toward the two animals, maintained eye contact with the larger wolf, and did not move backward. The smaller wolf broke first. It took 3 steps to the right, off the trail, into the tree line, and disappeared. The larger animal held for another 10 seconds, perhaps 15, its gaze fixed on Marcus with an intelligence and a steadiness that he found deeply unsettling. And then it turned, without apparent urgency, and followed the other animal into the trees. The trail was clear. Marcus stood there for a moment, breathing. Then he moved. He moved quickly now, not running, but not the measured recreational hiking pace he had been maintaining. He moved with intention and urgency, eating up the trail in long, efficient strides, talking continuously, calling out at every change in terrain, every blind corner, every section of dense tree cover that limited his sight lines. He checked behind him every few minutes, a fast, deliberate scan, not the panicked, over-the-shoulder glance of a frightened person, but a systematic visual sweep of his back trail. The sounds in the trees on either side of him never fully stopped. For the next 3 kilometers, the intermittent parallel movement continued, sometimes closer, sometimes further back, occasionally absent for 5 or 10 minutes at a stretch before returning. He heard one more short howl, behind him, approximately 40 minutes after the clearing encounter. He could not tell how far back it was. He did not stop to try to estimate. The light was dropping. In the summer months, he would have had 3 more hours of usable daylight at this point in the afternoon. But it was late October in the Canadian Rockies, and the flat, overcast sky was accelerating the dusk in a way that compressed his timeline significantly. He checked his headlamp, found it in his chest pocket where it always lived, confirmed the batteries were good. He had made a point of carrying fresh batteries, and he was grateful for that now in a way that felt almost spiritual. He was 7 kilometers from the trailhead. He stopped at the next stream crossing to drink and to think. The creek was shallow enough to cross on exposed rocks without getting his feet wet, which mattered, because wet feet in near-freezing temperatures over a 7-kilometer trail at night was a problem he did not need added to his current set of problems. He drank, filtered, filled his bottle, and while he was crouched at the water's edge, he did something that he would later identify as one of the most important things he did all day. He made a deliberate, methodical assessment of his situation. He had water, he had food, though his appetite had been completely suppressed by adrenaline, and he knew it would come crashing back later. He had shelter, he could deploy in 15 minutes if necessary. He had his headlamp, he had fire-starting capability. He had bear spray with approximately 80% of its charge remaining. He had a map, a compass, and a GPS that showed him exactly where he was and exactly how far he had to go, and he had the trail, which was clear and followable even in poor light. What he did not have was certainty about where the wolves were. He had not heard movement in the trees for nearly 20 minutes. That could mean they had lost interest, or it could mean they were resting, or it could mean they had moved to a position that he could not hear from the stream. He did not know, and he made peace with not knowing, because not knowing was the reality of the situation, and spending energy on anxious speculation about it would cost him something he could not afford to lose. He needed his mind clear. He needed his decision-making sharp. He was 7 kilometers from his vehicle. The temperature was going to drop into the low single digits within the next 2 hours, and he had work to do. He stood up, adjusted his pack straps, turned his headlamp on, even though he could still see clearly enough without it, because the light and sound of his presence mattered, and he kept moving. The next 2 kilometers were the hardest. The trail entered a section of old-growth forest where the canopy closed overhead and reduced the remaining light to almost nothing at ground level before his headlamp made up the difference. The trees here were enormous, ancient spruce and fir, with trunk diameters that required 4 people with linked arms to span, their root systems creating a broken, uneven terrain that demanded full attention on every footfall. He moved carefully but quickly, finding his rhythm in the headlamp beam, trusting his feet in the way that only comes with years of backcountry movement, the kind of deep muscle memory that keeps you upright and moving efficiently, even when your conscious mind is engaged with calculating distances and listening to the darkness beyond your light. It was in this section that he heard the closest sound. He had just cleared a particularly large fallen tree, stepping up and over its root mass in the practiced way of someone who does this kind of thing regularly, when he heard something to his right that was close enough to feel as well as hear. Something large, moving fast, 30 meters, perhaps 25. The sound lasted 2 seconds, maybe 3, the explosive burst of a heavy animal covering ground at speed through undergrowth, and then silence. Marcus did not stop. He turned his headlamp in the direction of the sound, held his bear spray extended, spoke loudly and firmly, and kept walking. He did not see anything. The beam reached perhaps 20 meters into the trees and found nothing but trunks and shadow. He kept walking. He talked louder. He made himself sound, as he described it later, like a person who was entirely comfortable with their situation and completely unafraid of whatever was in those trees. He did not feel either of those things, but he understood, at a level below rational thought, that the performance of confidence mattered in this moment in a way that was almost indistinguishable from actual confidence. He was 5 kilometers from the trailhead. The terrain opened slightly, the old growth giving way to a section of younger, more open forest where avalanche activity years earlier had cleared a swath through the hillside and allowed a second generation of trees to establish. Marcus could see further here. The sky above the open section was darker than the forest had been, the overcast sky glowing faintly with whatever ambient light remained in it, and in that relative openness he scanned systematically and saw, at the edge of the young forest on his left, 2 glowing points of light at approximately animal eye height that appeared and disappeared as something moved in the shadows. He counted them, 2 eyes, 1 animal. It was standing still, watching him from the tree line, staying with the shadows. He called out, firmly, maintained his pace, watched the eye shine until it faded as the animal moved further back into the trees or turned away. He kept walking. 4 kilometers from the trailhead, he hit the switchbacks. The lower trail in this section was a series of long, descending switchbacks that dropped the elevation significantly over approximately 2 kilometers, bringing the route from the forested hillside down to the valley floor, where the trail would then run relatively flat for the final 2 kilometers to the trailhead. The switchbacks were, in one sense, good news because they were taking him down, toward the road, toward his vehicle, toward the end of this. In another sense, they were tactically uncomfortable, because the nature of switchbacks meant that his direction of travel was changing constantly, that his sense of the back trail was complicated by the turns, and that the terrain on either side compressed and opened alternately in ways that made consistent situational awareness difficult. He moved through the switchbacks methodically, pausing at each turn to scan in all directions before committing to the next section, making noise throughout, staying in the center of the trail where possible to maximize his reaction distance to either side. The sounds in the trees had been absent for the better part of a kilometer, and he was beginning to allow himself the first cautious edges of a thought that they might be gone, that the pack had turned to other business, that the interest they had shown in him for the past several hours had simply faded. This thought lasted until he was on the third to last switchback, approximately 3 kilometers from the trailhead, when he heard the full chorus of the pack howling from the ridge behind him. Not communication howls, not the short declarative notes of animals coordinating movement. The long, rising, sustained howl of a pack asserting itself, marking something, responding to something. The sound echoed off the valley walls and filled the night air with a resonance that is almost impossible to describe to someone who has never heard it at close range, in the dark, with no one else around for kilometers in any direction. Marcus stopped and listened. He counted the voices. 5. Definitely 5. Possibly 6. The pack was behind him, on the ridge, above him, but the distance was hard to read in the echo. He thought perhaps a kilometer, perhaps less. He checked his GPS. 2.8 kilometers to the trailhead. He moved as fast as he safely could. The remaining switchbacks he cleared in a controlled, urgent descent that pushed the edge of what was reasonable, given the trail condition and his headlamp beam, but did not cross into the kind of reckless speed that would turn a twisted ankle into a survival emergency on top of everything else he was already managing. He knew what a bad footfall on a loose rock trail in the dark would cost him, and he moved fast, but he moved with attention, every footfall considered, every weight transfer deliberate. He hit the valley floor at a pace that was as close to a run as he had allowed himself since this began. The final 2 kilometers of the trail ran through dense riparian forest along the Valley Creek, the vegetation close on both sides, the trail soft and quiet underfoot, the headlamp beam cutting a cone of visibility through a darkness that was now fully established. He moved through it with everything he had, talking, calling out, listening, watching, bearing spray in hand, pack bouncing on his back, as his pace accelerated towards something that he did not want to acknowledge yet as relief. Because relief was something you felt when you were actually, definitively, without question safe, and he was not there yet. He heard the howling one more time, further away now, or from a different direction, difficult to tell. He did not stop to work it out. He kept moving. He came out of the trees and into the gravel parking area of the trailhead at 7:43 in the evening. He could see his vehicle, a dusty gray pickup, parked exactly where he had left it 4 days ago. There was one other vehicle in the lot, a van with an Alberta plate, empty. The parking area was lit by a single overhead light on a pole that cast a yellow pool of illumination over the gravel and caught the reflective strips on his pack as he crossed to his truck. He sat down on the rear bumper of his vehicle, and he did not move for a long time. He sat there with his bear spray still in his hand, listening to the forest he had just walked out of, and after a while the shaking started, the full-body involuntary shaking that is the nervous system processing what has just happened, releasing the grip it has been holding for hours, and he let it happen, sitting on that bumper in the yellow light of that parking lot, and eventually it stopped. He drove to the nearest town, 40 minutes on a logging road, found a gas station that was still open, and ate an entire bag of chips and 2 chocolate bars sitting in his truck in the parking lot. He called his emergency contact to let them know he was out. He sat for another 20 minutes before he felt capable of the highway driving back to the city. He filed a detailed incident report with provincial wildlife authorities the following morning. He included GPS coordinates of all the significant encounters, timestamps from his device, and a written account that ran to 11 pages. The wildlife biologists who reviewed the report noted that the wolf pack he had encountered was a known pack that had been monitored in the region for 3 years, a group of 6 to 8 animals whose territory encompassed the valley corridor he had been traveling through. The biologists classified the encounter as a follow behavior rather than a hunt, a distinction that is meaningful in the technical literature, but that, as Marcus noted when he read the report, felt somewhat abstract when you are the one being followed. They also noted, without any particular drama, that the pack had shadowed him for approximately 9 kilometers. 9 kilometers. From his first sighting of the single wolf in the clearing to the moment he stepped onto the gravel of the parking lot. Now here is where this account becomes something more than a remarkable personal story, because the details of what Marcus experienced that evening in the Kananaskis backcountry illuminate something important about the nature of wild spaces and the creatures that actually own them, and about the particular quality of attention that is required of human beings when they move through country that has its own rules. Wolves are not the mythological monsters that centuries of European folklore made them. They are also not the benign, human-tolerant wildlife neighbors that a certain strain of modern nature writing sometimes depicts. They are highly intelligent, deeply social, strategically capable predators, whose behavior is shaped by a complexity of factors that human observers rarely have the full context to interpret in the moment. The pack that followed Marcus had almost certainly been aware of him long before he was aware of them. They had been in that valley, on that ridge system, through that forest corridor for years. They knew every feature of that terrain in a way that no human being with a GPS and a topographic map could replicate. And on that Thursday afternoon in late October, they had made a decision about him. Whether that decision was pure curiosity, whether it was territorial assessment, whether it was the early stages of something more predatory that was ultimately discouraged by his behavior, whether it was a combination of all of these things that shifted and changed across the 9 kilometers of their following, no one can say with certainty. Not the biologists who reviewed the report, not Marcus, not anyone who was not a wolf on that hillside. What can be said is that Marcus's behavior throughout the encounter was textbook in the best possible sense. Not textbook as in following rules he had memorized, but textbook as in the accumulated wisdom encoded in those guidelines was reflected in his instinctive decision-making when it actually mattered. He did not run. He did not abandon his pack. He did not panic into actions that would have escalated the situation in dangerous ways. He maintained situational awareness without allowing anxiety to collapse into tunnel vision. He made noise. He maintained a confident presence. He kept moving towards safety with discipline and efficiency, and he got out. But there is something else in Marcus's account that deserves more than a passing mention, because it speaks to something deeper than technique, something that is relevant whether you are a backcountry hiker or simply someone who has ever been confronted by a situation that tested the outer boundary of what you believed you could handle. Marcus did not know, at any point during those 9 kilometers, whether he was going to be all right. He did not have the comfort of certain knowledge that the wolves would not press their engagement, that his bear spray would be sufficient if they did, that his body would hold up across the distance, that the trail would remain followable, that the weather would hold, that he would not make a mistake. He did not know any of those things. He was operating in genuine uncertainty, the real kind, not the managed uncertainty of a training scenario, or the retrospective uncertainty of a story being told from safety. And he kept moving. He kept making decisions. Small decisions, dozens of them, constant adjustments, constant assessment, constant recommitment to the direction of safety. Not because he was certain those decisions were right, but because he understood that the only thing worse than making a decision in uncertainty is making no decision at all. That paralysis, in the wilderness as in most things, is its own kind of catastrophe. He kept talking. He kept his hands steady enough. He kept his legs moving, and across 9 kilometers of dark forest with a wolf pack tracking him through the trees, he was enough. He was exactly enough. There is something about the scale of wild spaces, the genuine indifference of mountains and forests, and the animals that inhabit them, that recalibrates a human being in ways that are difficult to articulate afterward. People who have been through serious wilderness experiences often describe coming home to a world that seems paradoxically smaller, and also more vivid, as though the compression of genuine necessity has stripped away a layer of noise that normally sits between a person and direct experience. Marcus described something similar when he talked about the drive home that night. The highway lights, the roadside businesses, the other vehicles, all of it seemed almost unreal, too bright and too calm, and somehow slightly unconvincing, like a painting of a world rather than the world itself. And then, he said, gradually, it came back. The normal world reasserted itself. The adrenaline finished metabolizing. He ate a real meal and slept for 12 hours and woke up to a day that was exactly like any other day. He went to work. He answered emails. He did the ordinary, uneventful, entirely safe things that constitute the texture of daily life. But every once in a while, he said, usually in the early morning before full wakefulness, he hears it again. The chorus of the pack on the ridge behind him, 5 voices, maybe 6, filling the mountain dark with a sound that is ancient and indifferent and extraordinary. And lying there in his ordinary bed, in his ordinary city, he feels again the specific aliveness of that moment. Not the fear, or not only the fear, the complete, unambiguous presence of being somewhere that mattered, where everything was real and immediate and entirely without pretense. He said he was still deciding how he felt about it. He said he was probably going back. Not to the same valley, not in late October, not alone, and not without a great deal more preparation for encounters of exactly this kind. But back to the backcountry, back to the high alpine and the dark forest, and the country that belongs to the animals that have lived there since long before the first human being laced up a pair of boots and pointed themselves at a trailhead. Because the wilderness is not a backdrop for human experience. It is not a recreational facility with wild aesthetics. It is a functioning, complex, self-governing system of extraordinary sophistication in which human beings are occasional visitors, tolerated or not, significant or not, at the discretion of forces that have nothing to do with whether we are experienced or well-equipped or following the correct protocols. The wolves on that Kananaskis Ridge were not interested in Marcus's 11 years of backcountry experience. They were not impressed by his trip plan or his quality gear or his knowledge of their behavior. They assessed him by a set of criteria that had nothing to do with any of that, and they made their judgment, and on that particular Thursday evening, that judgment went a certain way, and Marcus walked out to his truck and drove home, and lived to tell the story. That is the whole truth of it. The rest, the preparation, and the technique, and the decision-making framework, and all of the accumulated wisdom that experienced wilderness travelers carry with them, all of that matters enormously. It shapes the odds. It creates options. It gives a person more and better choices in the moments when choices matter most. Marcus's experience was not a matter of pure luck. His behavior was skilled, and it was consequential. What happened was shaped by what he did. But the wilderness does not make guarantees. The mountains do not negotiate. The wolves on that ridge were operating according to their own logic, a logic that is coherent and sophisticated and entirely focused on their own needs and the dynamics of their own world. And human beings who move through wild country are moving through that world as guests, or perhaps more accurately as one variable among many, in a system that was there first and will be there long after the last trailhead sign has rotted back into the earth. Marcus understood